can you explain, what do you mean by the term discretionary monetary policy? What does that mean?
Oh, certainly. So when you have a central bank like the Federal Reserve or the Bank of England, the Bank of Japan, et cetera, each of these institutions have discretion over how they're handling monetary policy. So instead of having a monetary policy like we had before the Federal Reserve, where currency is issued by private institutions and the amount of the issuance is strictly based on what kind of precious metal reserves, like gold, that they have. In other words, we can only issue a certain number of dollars for a certain amount of gold sitting in our vaults. Once you get away from that system and you get towards central banking, they being the central bankers, are in charge of increasing or decreasing the money supply at their discretion. And they will do it for various reasons. But essentially with MMT, they completely ignore the very first lesson of economics, which is scarcity. And essentially, if something is not scarce, then it can't have value. This is illustrated very well in the diamond water paradox lesson in economics, where the price for diamonds is much, much higher than the price for water. But that doesn't really make much sense at first, because the utility of diamonds is actually very, very low compared to the utility of water. You will pay much more for water over the course of your lifetime than you will for diamonds. Why? Because the total utility that you get from that water being able to survive is much higher than the utility you could possibly get from those diamonds. So how do we explain the differential in price? It's because demand is only one side of the equation, supply is the other. And it's the interaction of those two that actually gives us a price level. So because water is so abundant and because diamonds are so scarce, that dictates a much higher price for diamonds. Now, we may need a new lesson after a few years, because we're seeing synthetic diamonds now become quite popular, which is greatly increasing the supply. So the price of diamonds will probably come down substantially in the future. But whatever the case may be, for at least the time being, it makes sense to use this analogy. So MMT advocates completely ignore that entire lesson. And they say, look, we can just print as much money as we want. And that completely ignores the fact that there has to be a demand for dollars. You can't just have a supply. There has to be a demand. And it's going to be, again, that interaction of supply and demand that determines the price of dollars. In other words, what a dollar is worth, which means what a dollar can buy. And so if you're just going to blow out the supply of dollars, then what happens? Well, you haven't changed the demand. And so the supply relative to demand has increased, which means the price of the dollar, in other words, what the dollar can buy, goes down. This is precisely what we have seen over the last several years. The MMTers had their way beginning really in 2020. They got everything that they wanted. And they said, oh, look, no inflation. Well, inflation takes a little bit of time to kick in. It doesn't happen immediately. And effectively, we have relearned the same lesson that we had to learn in the 1970s, which is if you print trillions upon trillions of dollars to try to finance these massive government deficits, you will get runaway inflation. That's precisely what we're suffering with today.
Yeah, and on that, so folks, I'll link on a different podcast that I'm on. We went through this claim because you may know, EJ, like Stephanie Kelton and some other MMT people, they're currently running victory laps saying we totally called it on inflation. It was transitory. And I'm like, what are you talking about? And I went and dug clips off the top of my head right now. I don't remember exactly when it was from, but it was like when consumer price inflation was ticking up and had broken into like the 5% year over year. And Stephanie Kelton was on Bloomberg or something, and they were asking her, and she was like, oh yeah, this is transitory. This is just supply shocks, bottlenecks from the lockdown. I mean, so it's kind of like, what would have to happen for you guys to admit you were wrong about it? You know what I mean? It's to say transitory inflation doesn't mean as long as it at some point comes down, then it's transitory. You know what I mean? Like, yeah, the hyperinflation in Weimar Germany eventually came down, so I guess that was just transitory. You know what I mean? So the way they're using this term is like
transitory in the sense that it transitioned higher.
Right. Right. So on that score, again, that they do often give the caveat like, hey, we're not just saying run the money printer and no problem. Like, no, we know there's inflation. And so it's like, okay. And so then when inflation did rear its ugly head, the worst, that the U.S. has experienced 40 years, you'd think they'd say, okay, let's pull it. No, they're not saying the government needs to stop spending so much. Anyway, it's interesting to call their bluff, as it were. Do you mind, can you just bang through what the other 6 schools of thought were when you were teaching that? Because I can imagine what some of them would be, but I'm not sure I know exactly which 6 you have in mind.
Oh, certainly. And some of this is, I would say, are a little roughly named. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, one of the schools is neoclassical. And there are plenty of economists who would say, I am a neoclassical economist, but they wouldn't quite abide by all the principles in that school of monetary thought. So give me a little bit of rope here, I would say.
Sure thing. Yeah.
So the first 2 would be classical and Keynesian. And then after that, you have monetarist, which is a little bit of a combination of both of those. The way I like to put it is that they look at the classicalists as being right in the long run, but the Keynesians as being right in the short run. And then after that, you have neo-Keynesian and neoclassicalist, and then finally an anti-fractional reserve system.